Today we have another Hometown Historian channel production. Enjoy.
All right, so there we are, 1756 Fort Henry. It would have been out that direction somewhere, but it was a French and Indian War fort. It's the Historical Society of Berks County put that stone up there, but this is back on Fort Henry Road. So it is out that way somewhere, and we'll make a little bit more video-wise of talking about Fort Henry, its significance. It was sort of guarding, I think, Tulpehocken Path as that came over was the purpose of it. But this was one of those sanctioned forts by the Pennsylvania, I guess, Colonial Congress, that they like, okay, we need to have a fort at this location as well. But this is the area somewhere in here. Whether there's something left or not, probably not. But anyways. So we'll add a little bit more here on the video and try to talk about as much as I can research history-wise. Thanks, everybody.
Fort Henry, built in 1756, garrisoned during the French and Indian War by troops under Captain Christian Buss, Pennsylvania's major frontier defense east of Fort Augusta, Sunbury. The site is a 3/4 mile to the northwest. This historic marker, oddly enough, is not there right now, so I'm assuming they take them down for repair sometime, so that's why we didn't film on location for this, because it's just not there right now. So Fort Henry was built in made into a fort in 1756, because this was originally apparently someone's home. Dietrich Six was the man's name, so it's known as Six's Fort. The official name is Fort Henry because it was one of these commissioned forts. It's also sometimes known as Buss's Fort because Captain Christian Buss was the commanding officer. This was about 14 miles east of Fort Swatara. It is considered in a lot of ways the most important easternmost fort from Fort Augusta, which was at Sunbury, also known as Shamokin, because it guarded the Tulpehocken Path. You had that little mountain that was sort of off to the east of Route 501, which was the Tulpehocken Path, and it was considered to be in the shadow where that stone marker is. There's sort of a pond there to the left of that marker, and they feel it's either where the pond is today, or because it's a man-made pond, or it was right behind there, sort of a little elevated, which was made for a good defensive position. But they just started to have some attacks in that time period, and it was also another reason it was considered to be one of the most important, because this area, which at the time was Lancaster County but eventually became Berks County, it was one of the most populous areas, and it led to, of course, Reading, which was back, and that was a pretty heavy populated area for back then in the 1750s. They actually had where they started to first bring the attention, if you will, to the area. Conrad Weiser, who we've talked about, I still want to do the big video on him. He's a guy that's generally forgotten, unfortunately, because he did a lot in that time period to sort of keep the peace. His father actually sent him off to be, I believe, with the Iroquois tribe, so he learned languages. He learned their ways. He learned to respect their ways. And the Indians, or Native Americans, I should say, in return, respected Conrad Weiser because he was honest and he knew who they were, and they had spent quite a bit of time with them. But he had sent a letter to Governor Morris at the time. His sons were right, I think, south. It was Bethel at that time, which is the closest town. At that time, had just been founded, and it was named Millersburg at the time. And just south of that would have been the town of Tulpehocken, which eventually became Myerstown, and then Heidelberg was a little southeast of that, which is now Schaeferstown. But he was, I think, in the Heidelberg region at the time, which would have been Schaeferstown, and his sons were up there. There's only like 6 of them, and that was when the first Native American attack happened, and I guess they killed 2 of the Native Americans, but I think a couple of their guys also got killed as they were running towards the fort. And the whole thing was it was a mess. And he sent in detail what had happened from his son's description of the attack. And he said the biggest thing, which was also something we ran into when we did the research on Manada Gap and at Fort Manada, they were saying we need more ammunition, we need weapons. If you're not going to provide us with forts to protect ourselves, we need something. And they were just basically pleading, and being that it was Conrad Weiser, I think it finally got through to him, because the government of Pennsylvania at that time was very much Quaker, and Quakers believe in peace, believe in peaceful resolutions, nonviolence, that type of thing. And a lot of it came down to, it's not that attitude's a bad attitude, but there's a reality to it, and to what the settlers were going through, and it just came down to they didn't understand what was going on, because Philadelphia was safe, and they just didn't understand how bad it actually was out in those territories, because that was the frontier. And when Conrad Weiser put that through, I think it finally sort of clued him in. We need to do something about this. So several of these forts, like Fort Swatara, Fort Manada, a little bit later, Fort Hunter was a very important fort, and they had several of these. And then you had several of the smaller ones that were more places of refuge, like Reed's Fort, and some of these other, like Fort Manada, there were several other forts there, but Fort Henry was really all they had in this area, so it was considered to be essential to their survival. And being as well, it was so essential to protect that Tulpehocken Path, because that was their only way north at that time to go up to where Fort Augusta was at Sunbury. At that time, once again, it was called Shamokin. So sometimes it was referred to as the Shamokin Path, but normally it was referred to as the Tulpehocken Path, which they say here that the Tulpehocken Path, I guess, went the whole way to Philadelphia, which maybe in some way it did, but I'm not quite sure exactly, because it's really considered, from what I've researched and what I've done, the main path was considered to go from Wummelsdorf there at Conrad Weiser's homestead, and then up to what was then Shamokin. And we've visited Pilgeroo as well, which is just north up on top of the mountain there, the Blue Mountain, that Count Zinzendorf and Conrad Weiser were going north. Count Zinzendorf as missionary work to the tribes up there, and Conrad Weiser to work on different diplomacy and that type of stuff. But it's Fort Henry was not one of those forts that. It's cool. There's actually quite a bit of history too. So I might do one that's a video that's a little more in depth, just because it's so neat. And on that map that I have, it's sort of hard to make out in the video, but it's up on the top. Around the middle of that map is where Fort Henry lies, and then to the right on the top of the map is where it says Round Top, which is that substantial mountain hill there on the Blue Mountains. Like I said earlier in the film, I do have a picture of the Fort Henry marker. It just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I think it's out there because there are several that they take them down to repair them. Some are so far gone that they just can't repair them, and sometimes they don't replace them. But there was, at one time, there was a marker there for Fort Henry, and the marker on the site of it, the stone marker that was, I think, set there by the Berks County Historical Society, that's still there. You cannot go on the land, though it is private property, and they have signs everywhere because I'm sure they have issues with people, innocently wanting to go see the site of where this fort was, but you can't do that. So it just sort of is what it is. But so it's interesting. They had the guy that they had the home. I'll add this, Dietrich Six. He was a farmer and active in the community. They believe he's the Dietrich Six on the ship, the Thistle, from Rotterdam, and it arrived 1738 in September in Philadelphia. So he basically, I don't know if he necessarily volunteered his home, but it was the home that made the most sense to have as this fort. And that was sort of, but it was one of those, it wasn't like Reed's fort. Adam Reed surrendered his home to be used as a fort. This fort as well, I will mention, it housed up to almost 50 soldiers at a time, and it was used primary purpose more than anything, watching Tulpehocken Path, of course, but it was sort of for these guys because there was so much distance between this fort and the next fort that it was used for sort of roving patrols, just to watch and make sure there were no Native American war parties that were coming through. But it was an essential fort, and it served until 1759. I'm sorry, 1759, and it didn't get used, as far as I can see, in the second part of the French and Indian War. I guess that area just didn't suffer from having to worry about it, because there were some of the forts that sort of, a lot of them got decommissioned in 1759 once the war was over, but when it started up again, some of them came back into service, but some of them didn't. It just depended on how much activity was in those particular areas. But thanks for coming along as always. Learn a little bit more hometown history. And like I said, may go into this a little further at some point, and maybe go into the letters of Conrad Weiser pertaining to Fort Henry, because it's pretty intriguing, actually. Some of his letters, I was reading through them, and really goes into depth of what happened. It sort of gives you a different viewpoint of sort of the terror that they were going through at the time, how they were handling it, and that type of stuff. And sort of, sadly, how the Pennsylvania government at that time just was sort of clueless, and a lot more people died than really needed to. It just sort of was a continuing fight that was unnecessary. But with that, I'll say thank you as always, and we will see you all about town.